The largest container ships, when they're fully loaded with cargo, they're literally carrying right at about $1 billion worth of stuff.
On this episode of Executive Edge, Greg is joined by John McCown, a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy, an internationally recognized expert in container shipping and maritime commerce.
IBM, which was literally one of the first truly international companies, one of their early slogans in the 40s was world peace through world trade. They had the view that, when countries have commerce together, it's benefiting both of them.
John discusses maritime shipping, the impact of tariffs on international trade, and key learnings from decades of experience.
Why doesn't the U.S. have one of the largest shipping companies by fleet capacity?
It really kind of largely goes back to...
Welcome to this episode of the Executive Edge podcast. Today I've got a very special guest. John McCown is with us today. John is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy. John is an internationally recognized expert in container shipping and maritime commerce. He has more than 4 decades of operating and investment experience in the field. Folks, this is a true expert in shipping with us today. These days, John is advising, lecturing, and writing extensively about maritime issues, and his regular reports on the container shipping sector are widely read and quoted. You may have seen John on some major news programs. John, great to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here, Greg. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about shipping and tariffs and what's going on in my world.
Excellent. Yeah, I can't wait to get into the tariffs. But before we do, you had such an amazing career. I'd like to start at the very beginning. You were in banking. I believe you were a corporate loan officer. So let's get started there and kind of take us through your career journey and some of the experience you've had, because I think our audience is really going to find you're incredibly credible after coming through this, talking through your career.
I grew up in Alabama, but my first job out of college was working for a bank in New York. I had rationalized that didn't really know what I wanted to do in the business world, but I thought that banking could always be transferable. And going to a place like New York would give you the best experience. And my simple game plan was to come to New York for a few years and go back to Alabama. And that would translate into all sorts of benefits. And, I never really left the New York area and enjoyed my banking. And that was kind of the foundation. Went off to business school. And then I spent all of my time since then in the shipping industry.
What was it that helped you make that move, if you will, from banking into the shipping industry?
The catalyst in between my banking and shipping experience, I was at business school. There happened to be an article in Business Week, a cover article about Malcolm McLean, and one of my professors came in the afternoon and held up this magazine and said, you ought to read this article. We kind of hope to teach you how to be kind of risk-taking entrepreneurs like this. And I read the article, and I was fascinated by what this gentleman was doing. Instead of the more typical getting a job with an investment bank, which is kind of a typical path somebody going to business school goes from commercial banking to an investment banking, I thought I would pursue a summer job working at this shipping company. And I sought them out. They weren't necessarily looking for a business school person, but they were kind of intrigued, and I worked at the company. And when I was there, I found out about a small group that worked with this entrepreneur, which, what he had done had fascinated me. And I pursued, working with the small group that worked with him after business school. And so that was kind of the roundabout way. But, I started in the kind of the finance and planning and analysis. And so my banking career had played real benefits in that. And, that's really been the career that I've stayed in my whole life.
And you've mentioned this entrepreneur. His name is Malcolm McLean. And I'm going to let you tell the audience who Malcolm McLean is. But I believe he mentored you for 20 years. Is that right?
I ended up working on really a daily basis with him for 20 years. And that relationship grew and kind of expanded, started my just working on deployments with him, and we developed a very close professional and personal relationship. Many years before I was with him, around the time I was born, he's the gentleman that invented container shipping in 1956. And container shipping, of course, moves the large majority of the world's trade. When I was with him, it was towards the tail end of his career, but he had just bought a company called U.S. Lines. That was the cover article in Business Week. And he was already in his late 60s when he did that. But U.S. Lines was the largest competitor to a company called Sealand, which was the company that he had founded. And Malcolm had many years earlier had sold Sealand to R.J. Reynolds, so he wasn't involved, but he had an interest in getting involved in the business. So one of the magazines, I think it was Forbes, said it's as if Henry Ford had come out of retirement and bought Chrysler, using the analogy for what Malcolm did with U.S. Lines. And so U.S. Lines was much smaller, but Malcolm proceeded to build it up with buying additional companies, but mainly with a new shipbuilding program, which at the time was the largest shipbuilding contract in history. And the ships that he was building were larger by 30% of any vessel afloat. So I really, even though that was certainly container shipping had been invented, in a book that I later wrote, I referred to what Malcolm did with the econ ships, which is what we call these large ships, was really kind of the second container revolution. And in some ways, just as powerful as the first, because what it did was, container shipping, it's the process of moving goods in a container and all of the savings from that. But what Malcolm did with the econ ships was open up the door for the giant scale economies. You had ships that were more than 1,200 feet long, before that, but it was the tankers and other ships. Container shipping, the ships were big, but they weren't massive. And the econ ships became the beginning of that trend. And that trend is continued in a rather major way. What's amazing to me, the econ ships, we knew they were big, and there were many people thought they were too big. They were 30% larger than any ship afloat. Today, the largest container ships in the world are literally more than 6 times the size of the econ ships. So that's an indication of what that second container revolution kind of led to.
Wow. If we can stop here for a second, because I think there's first I want to make sure the audience appreciates. So the container ships, I think most people know what those are, but if you don't, they're the large ships you see with all the boxes stacked on them, shipping containers, right? People are turning shipping containers into homes and everything these days, but that's a massive load coming into a port. And as these ships grow, I'm assuming there has to be trickle-on infrastructure plays that have to be made, I guess, and investments to be made to unload and load these ships, being that much bigger. Is that true?
Definitely. The container shipping is really the ship itself is really only about a third of your cost. It's really, you should think of it as a system, and certainly you have to have massive terminals with these giant container cranes, specialized cranes. So a container ship really is obviously the integral part of it, but it relies on all of these other things with a very regular scheduled service. Yeah. And of course, by moving container goods in containers, you're making the whole loading and unloading process much more efficient. Now, the biggest ships, they use the term TEU for 20-foot equivalent unit. The largest container ships in the world today are literally over 24,000 TEU. So 24,000 boxes that are 20 feet long, 8 feet high, 8 feet wide. Now, most of the boxes are actually 40s, so half as many. But the point is, you have on any given ship, a large ship, you will have freight moved by hundreds of customers going to dozens of different places, and that therein lies one of the efficiencies of container shipping. These ships will always be in a scheduled service, where they make a call every week, say. It takes 5 vessels to have a weekly spring from the U.S. to the Far East. But those ships will be carrying cargo at all times for different shippers. So you have that benefit that kind of accrues to it. And of course, the efficiency in unloading these boxes rather than unloading the individual goods, they then travel inland because they're put on the back of a chassis or they're put on a railroad. And so, you don't have to reload it. The boxes provide security. They also protect the goods. With a large container ship today, the largest container ships, when they're fully loaded with cargo, they're literally carrying right at about $1 billion worth of stuff.
Wow.
Roughly the value of each TU is about $53,000. So each of these ships is kind of a major kind of economic catalyst, when it comes into a port.
Right.
But the reality is that world trade couldn't exist anywhere near it exists without the efficiency of container shipping. One of the more amazing statistics, and this underscores how efficient it is, if you take the value of the stuff that are moved annually in container ships, that's now about $8 trillion, trillion with the T. And if you take the entire revenue of the container shipping industry, that's going to barely be about 2 or 3% of that. So obviously the industry makes a profit. More recently, it's been a pretty good profit. So the cost of moving these goods kind of from one part of the world to another, in many cases, is a small single-digit percentage. So that kind of underscores, the whole concept of globalization that people talk about. It's driven by the efficiency at being able to move something halfway around the world for a fairly modest percentage of the value of that cargo. Now, I happen to believe, and it's provable, that the trade that we and all countries do collectively benefits that country. It's irrefutable. But like any sort of capitalistic initiative, and it's disruptive. And so there are people that are disrupted, but collectively container shipping and trade is good for the country as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's no exaggeration to say that we wouldn't have the degree of commerce or in the amount of goods flowing like we do today, and these amazing supply chains that have been built without container shipping sitting right in the middle of it.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I'd even take it a step further. It even goes beyond economics because the trade that we're engaged in, has a way of lessening tension. IBM, which was literally one of the first truly international companies, one of their early slogans in the 40s was world peace through world trade, and they had the view that, when countries have commerce together, there's it's benefiting both of them. It certainly reduces tensions. We certainly have that even with all the tensions that kind of exist between China and the U.S. I happen to think, and I think it's almost irrefutable, that the level of trade makes those less than they would be. Most historians will tell you, and it's kind of now pretty acknowledged, that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a major catalyst of that was, you go back at that time, believe it or not, the U.S. was a major exporter of oil. Japan got most of their oil from the U.S. and allies, and when President Roosevelt cut that oil off, the Japanese economy only had a certain amount of time that it could last. They were almost, historians would say they were presented with something where they almost had to upset that, by attacking. And the same time they attacked Pearl Harbor, they took over Indonesia, and that became their gas station. So we need to be cognizant of the lessons of history, that
right.
Not only does trade make us reduce tensions, to take aggressive stops to cut off trade, if it has an impact on another country, can raise tensions. But yeah, it's irrefutable the economic benefits, I think, of trade.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good history lesson there. We're going to come back to the balance of trade and the tariffs, especially a little bit further in here. But I want to keep going. So you worked with the person who invented container shipping. I'm sure you learned a ton of great knowledge from him, and then you went on to start and build TrailerBridge, right? Tell us about TrailerBridge. What was the business model there? What service were you performing?
Well, this was a smaller carrier, much smaller than U.S. Lines, but a carrier that we started, Malcolm and I, to move cargo to Puerto Rico, between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. And there's a law called the Jones Act where that trade has to be handled by U.S. owned, U.S. built vessels. And so we spent a couple of years looking at what was the most attractive Jones Act markets. We had some ideas that really rotated around making sure that our conveyance system worked the best with the inland side in the U.S. because the freight in all of these Jones Act markets tends to have a 3 or 4 or 500 mile inland leg before it gets to the port. And so we really kind of came up with a unique design. We elected to, our vessels were giant barges, which we were able to buy that existed, and we expanded them. And the biggest ones were actually, kind of think of it as a 3-story parking garage, about 800 feet long. And so we designed these to move first just 48-foot trailers, and then 53-foot containers and trailers. And we did that because that was the way freight moved, in the domestic market. And so we used the term, we kind of backed into the vessel. We kind of adapted the vessel to what works with the highway. So, and that, of course, was the whole concept of container shipping, except what happened with most international container shipping, they kind of stopped expanding the size when they get to 40-foot containers. And there are reasons that make sense, but in this particular niche market we were in Puerto Rico, we knew that going with the same size would make the most sense. So we started as a startup in a market that frankly wasn't growing very well, kind of somewhat flat, and a good year would be 1.5% growth. But because we had basically a better mousetrap, moving freight in larger sizes, and also the tug barges gave us certain cost economies, we were able to grow and expand. And we first enlarged the size of our vessels by cutting them in half and having a shipyard prior to that build a 250-foot mid-body. And so when you cut a vessel in half, it can be you're building the mid-body and you still have your vessel in service, comes into a shipyard, and you cut it in half fairly quick, and then you weld it back together. So there's a certain cost efficiency time-wise. And then we ended up building 5 new vessels that had some additional benefits. And so that was a very exciting period. Our company grew, and we ended up having about 10 or 12% of the market. In 2005, I think we made the cover of a magazine called American Shipper because they had done a survey. Our company, by the way, went public, and so our numbers were public, and people could see how we were doing. And many of the big international shipping companies are public. And so they did an article, and they were able to conclude that of all the container shipping companies in the world, little TrailerBridge had the highest ratio of operating income to revenue. I think we were something in the order of 17%. And I think that came from, it was the insight of, Malcolm was had passed away by this time, but he was certainly very involved in helping us design what would make sense. And it was really kind of paying attention to the assets and kind of coming up with a differentiated model, doing things different. Along the way, I came up with a couple of innovative things where I had 2 patents awarded to me. So it was really kind of a classic success story of, if you build a better mousetrap and give your customers value. And of course, certainly our competitors didn't welcome what we were doing, but it was well received in the marketplace.
Well, nice. Yeah, to be that kind of operating margin in such an asset heavy industry is admirable. So great that you IPO'd TrailerBridge, correct?
Yes, it was a IPO in 1997.
Great. And then you moved on from there and go to a hedge fund. Tell us about that. Tell us what you were doing for the Paulson Company, seeking alpha.
The final kind of chapter in TrailerBridge didn't end the way I had expected it to, and it turned out that our competitors, or a couple of them in particular, the way they had reacted to what we were doing was to engage in price fixing. And so there was a rather massive investigation. We never engaged in price fixing, but that kind of changed the market and led to a whole bunch of changes that ended up my not being involved with the company for reasons that aren't worth getting into. But so I was still wanted to stay active in the field that I knew, and thought that I had some insight in terms of the shipping industry, particular and transportation in general. And so I approached John Paulson, was a classmate of mine at business school. And by that time, he had a highly successful hedge fund, Paulson Company, most famously known as his prescient investments related to the housing crisis, which he made a lot of money for his investors, and also himself. And so I approached John with some ideas in terms of investing in shipping, and he liked those, and we gave it a test run, and we both liked it. So I ended up staying there about 5 years. And that was a great experience. It was energizing, working with an exceptionally bright group of people. By that time, most of them younger than I was. That was a very interesting switch for me, because in my operating career, I was quite accustomed to being on the younger side. When I took the company public, I was barely 40, and most of my direct reports were older than I was. And then you flip the switch, and I went into this hedge fund world, and all of a sudden I was, most of the young people were, a generation under me. So that was it took a little getting used to. I observed to my wife that I felt like my middle age had been robbed from me. I never really kind of experienced business in kind of that middle sweet spot. But that was a great experience, and I enjoyed it. And it told me that my knowledge of the industry itself, could translate into good investment decisions. And then that even had me thinking, because the Paulson, as big as it was, the size investments, put many of the companies I knew at a bit of a disadvantage. John was, a small investment for John was $100 million in a stock.
Right.
And, so I left with kind of the notion that I might start my own hedge fund, kind of focused on a broader array of smaller cap stocks. And in the midst of that, my transport vocation, if you will, is cycling. I'm a cyclist, and I like to get on my bike most days, if weather permitting. I was in a very bad biking accident. A car came up behind me, and that had me kind of, out of circulation for about 6 months. And that led to me rethinking kind of what I wanted to do. And I found myself kind of working on some entrepreneurial projects, and that kind of brought me to, what I'm doing these days.
Right. And it's a long title, but non-resident senior fellow. So you're a fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy. What's the mission of that center? And tell us maybe about your role there, what you're doing today.
Yeah, the Center for Maritime Strategy is a think tank affiliated with the Navy, or it's officially part of the Navy League. And it was established about 4 years ago. It's headed up by a 4-star retired Admiral, Jamie Fogo. Jamie used to head up most of our submarine forces, or kind of the European command, and he's now dean of the center. And there's got a great group of other fellows, that many of whom are experts in naval strategy and vessels. I was brought on more in terms of the commercial side. One of the kind of the overlap of merchant marine and military, of course, is things like sea lift, and that's become much more important, or recognized as more important these days. With issues potentially related to China, and so there's been kind of a groundswell in the past few years of people in D.C. becoming aware that our sea lift isn't what it should be. Because if you were to get into any sort of national emergency, and this has been proven, conflict after conflict, even more recently with the Iraq War, is that the only merchant marine you can really count on is U.S. flag vessels. And that probably even more so today, the pressure that would be put on anybody. And so we need to be cognizant of that, and just take smart steps. So at the center, my writings and research kind of focus on that intersection of commercial shipping and sea lift. And and it's I love doing that work. I also stay busy with a couple of reports that I put out. I have a monthly report on container volume, kind of a quarterly report on the results of the container shipping industry, that have become kind of well received and frequently quoted. So I'm kind of I guess I've kind of become a bit of I'm well beyond being kind of the young kid. I'm kind of on the other side, kind of like and the pundit, if you will, the gray-haired pundit, and things related to maritime. But I do enjoy that. I do enjoy that work.
Well, at this point in your career, John, you have crystallized intelligence, which is commonly referred to as wisdom, and it's good to have you around to share that, because you got to earn your way to crystallized intelligence. You don't just wake up with that one day, right? When you're younger, you have fluid intelligence, and now that wisdom's great. So you talked about sort of the threat, if you will, to the U.S. given the commercial, and that brought to think about a post that our friend Howard, my colleague Howard Graham, and Howard, I know he put up last week, and it was from I think the data was from Alpha Liner. I want to make sure I credit that, but it showed the top 10 shipping companies by fleet capacity. And it was amazing to Howard, and also amazing to me when I saw the post, that the U.S. does not have a single fleet in the top 10, right? The top 3 are in Europe. And then looking elsewhere, I see Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, even Israel's in the top 9. So help us understand that. Why doesn't the U.S. have one of the largest shipping companies by fleet capacity? And why aren't they on this top 10 list? What's your opinion on that?
That's a disappointing and kind of unfortunate situation that we're in, that is very different than when I was started in the industry. When I started, the largest container shipping company was Sealand, and most of its ships were U.S. flag. U.S. Lines was right up there. You had American President Lines, multiple other container shipping companies. There's a little bit the APL, or American President Line, still exists as an entity. It's now part of CMA CGM, the French company, and Maersk also has a handful of U.S. flagships. But you're right, that list of foreign carriers, is kind of devoid of really any U.S. representation. It really kind of largely goes back to up until the 80s, the U.S. was significantly supporting its maritime industry. It was kind of viewed, for the reasons I talked about, that it was kind of a special strategic industry. You needed to have it And so we had programs. We had something called a construction differential subsidy program. If you built a ship in the U.S., the government would pay about half of the cost, which was meant to equalize the cost. If you operated a ship U.S. flag, the government would pay that. The largest company at the time, Sealand, actually chose not to get government subsidy because they didn't like the constraints they put them on. But the other companies got that subsidy and would still even build ships in the U.S. We moved away from that during the Reagan administration, and it's somewhat understandable, but a lot of it had to do with kind of a view we need to go back to the market. And then layered on top of that was a view that that was a little bit too kind of old world. There was a view that, the sea lift that was needed and central in World War II. I mean, it's irrefutable that in the absence of the sea lift capacity, the thousands of Victory and Liberty ships that were built, we could not have won the war. We couldn't have projected our force and our strength there. But I think in the 80s, there was kind of a view that, you don't need as much of that. So we moved away from that. The big irony in that was the same time we were moving away from that, China, for instance, was embracing it. There's a famous writer, intellectual, if you will. One historian said he was the most important strategic thinker in America of the 19th century. And yet he's somebody most people have never heard of, but Alfred Mayer Fahan, he ended up being head of the Naval War College, and he wrote a lot, and wrote a lot about naval strategy, but he also saw the strategy, a merchant marine and a navy is going hand in hand, and so he thought that the ability to it was very important to have a navy to control during the war and a merchant marine during peace. And so he saw those as kind of interconnected. So really the same time we moved away from that, China moved towards it, and I'm sure, Deng Xiaoping probably read some of Alfred Mayer Fahan's work. And so they funded major additional dollars into their shipbuilding industry, into their shipping industry. Just this one company, Costco, is public, but the government owns, 51% of it. But since it's been public, I think from 2005, its financials show over $2 billion of direct government subsidy to that one company. So that's how it happened. And again, it's not, the U.S. isn't unique. Many of the industrialized companies, whether it's Britain or France or, even though they're based in, CMA CGM is based in France, very few of their vessels are French flag. The other thing that has happened in a big way with shipping, because it's a hyper-competitive industry, some economists, the shipping broadly, have said that shipping industry is the most classic example of supply versus demand, because you have high fixed cost, and when you have excess capacity, rates drop to the bottom, and when you don't, they shoot up, and so that has gravitated towards costs. You don't want to have costs that are out of line, and so the large majority of the world's shipping are now flagged in what's called flag of convenience states or registries, and the big ones being Panama and Liberia and the Marshall Islands. And these registries get people to flag there because, one, you pay no income taxes. The shipping industry has one of the nicest income tax regimens where you really pay a fixed fee rather than economic income tax. And they also are perhaps more lax in terms of the crewing. And so you ended up with having owners making a rational decision that, I can't have my cost out of lock with my competitors. And so the U.S. is not alone in not having that, but, there are a bunch of initiatives kind of going on now to at least get us a little more involved, in shipping.
Yeah, it was just, that was really surprising. So I appreciate the background on that. Very helpful. So I want to move into tariffs and get your perspectives on the tariffs as a shipping expert. So I'll just start with, how do you see the tariffs impacting the shipping industry, and maybe discuss some of the cascading effects that come out of these tariffs?
Well, let me say at the outset that I'm very negative on tariffs. It shouldn't surprise, if I spent my career in an industry, and tariffs are basically meant to reduce trade. And and during most of my career, they kept on coming down. Prior to the first Trump administration, we basically lived in a tariff-free world. I think the weighted average tariff was like 1.5%. I don't think they make any sense. I don't think they, at least my analysis of the first Trump administration, they didn't do what their goal was. What the goal was to reduce imports. And because I follow the data pretty closely, I saw an initial impact, but after about 6 months, it was hard to tease out an impact in terms of imports. On the flip side, those tariffs brought with them countervailing tariffs that have impacted our exports. And so if you look at volume coming in and out of the U.S., our exports have been, since 2016, performing significantly worse than our imports. So that's almost the opposite of what you want to have, because those less exports, those tie into actual jobs in America, whereas the imports, that's a consumption thing. Secondarily, I think this gets kind of not to get too deep in the weeds, but the U.S. Is the reserve currency of the world, the dollar. Because of that, almost mathematically, we have people accumulating dollars, and it's going to be very difficult throughout history. Whoever was the reserve currency will operate a trade deficit. And you have the foreign exchange markets already kind of adjusting to what's going on. So all of this movement, the most tangible impact it will have is twofold, and this is the initial impact. The ultimate goal is that it would bring back jobs. But let's put that aside for a second. The immediate impact is, first, with less container volume, and going back to the numbers, each month the containers coming into U.S. ports are about $120 billion worth of stuff. If you have a big hit on that can't help but have ripple effects. Commercial activity will be reduced. There are a lot of people that make a lot of living, going well beyond the dock workers in terms of offloading that. So the first effect will be some amount of reduced commerce, which makes the economy grow less. And again, you take all the aggregate numbers, you're dealing with a pretty big slice of the economy. And so right now, you're going to see tariffs that are in place right now will probably knock down my analysis is the second half of this year, our volume is going to be off about 15%. So that's going to have a commercial growth effect. The other effect, there's still going to be a lot of boxes coming in with new tariffs, and call on average 20-25% tariff. Well, you can calculate how much inflation that is bringing in. So you're really at I don't know where we're going to be on that spectrum. I do know that the initial impact will both be less commercial activity, which means a smaller economy, and inflation. So what's the word for that? That's stagflation. So these tariffs, in my view, are like taking a giant bottle of stagflation and pouring it over the economy in terms of the immediate effect. Now, I know the ultimate effect is that the hope that it'll bring back jobs. That's where people don't have as good an understanding as they should. In America, we don't really import many complete products, certainly complete products that we could make here. The supply chains have gotten so complex. And so there was one academic whose work I follow very closely, Jason Miller out of Michigan State, did a study in terms of, because for instance, there's a 50% tariff on steel. And Jason wanted to look at who would be impacted by that. And sure enough, he came up with the number of steel jobs that, in theory, could produce, making more steel in the U.S. But then he also looked at the people that import components that are steel, and he came up with something on the order of 15 or 20 to 1. In other words, for every one job you added of somebody, in Pittsburgh at a blast furnace making more steel, you're losing, 15 jobs, out in the hinterland, because people all of a sudden you change their costs. So I just don't think they're particularly well thought out. And so I couldn't be more negative. And then on top of that, there's a plan to impose fees on Chinese built ships. And so all of and both that in particular will have certain ships simply not calling in the U.S. And so I look at the data, the China, right now the U.S. is say only about 15% of world trade. So the world will be able to adjust and adapt. The big loser in this will be America. We as consumers, we are all of a sudden we're losing that element of choice. When we, the deficit occurs when you and I, take our currency and buy a product that costs $100, but we don't see that we're losing $100 doing that. We see we're getting a product, that's worth at least $100. And if you take away that choice, it just doesn't strike me as good.
When you look at it, right, it's a cost increase. I don't think there's any such
Yes.
thing as a zero-sum game in global trade. There's always going to be a mismatch between two countries. Sometimes it probably lines up close, but, we're a big importer. We export less than we import. Those are facts. And that's how the economy's been running. But then all of a sudden you increase the price via tariffs of anything coming in. And the question then becomes, in my mind, who's going to absorb that? There's extra costs there now. Who's going to absorb it? Is it going to be the auto company or the electronics device builder? They might absorb some of it. I don't think you're going to see too many retailers or too many food and beverage companies, CPG companies, if you will, absorb that 100%.
Agreed.
And I think Goldman Sachs, the latest estimate that I looked at was 2/3 of it will end up on the consumer. So
I suspect in the end there might be some timing to avoid people being targeted, but I think in the end all of it is going to be paid by us. And I think this the mental gymnastics that people go through thinking, well, maybe it won't be. It's kind of when was the last time you heard somebody say when the federal excise tax on gasoline comes up? How many people are sitting back pontificating? Well, let me see. Maybe will Exxon eat part of that, or will the filling station operator? We don't go through that sort of silly machinations. We say,
No.
of course, we're going to pay for it, and it even gets worse. In some cases, it becomes a cover. I'm a shopper. At Costco. I like the value at Costco. I like the fresh fruit and vegetables. And
right there with you.
yeah, and Costco has a simple model, their cost plus 15%. And so one of the things I love is avocados. And as soon as my avocados, 6 avocados were $7.99. And as soon as there were talk of a tariff increase in Mexico, they were $8.99. And when the talk was it'd be 25%, it got up to like $10.99. So Costco was even before it came into being, they've settled back down, but they were price adjusting based on the news. There were other products. I love these dried mangoes, and they were always $10.99. And I go in and all of a sudden see they're $18.99, and I look at where they're from, and it was Vietnam. And so when the so-called reciprocal tariff was announced, about something like 45%, they went up immediately. They've since settled back down, and but so my point is, I've seen way too many situations where, and this is particularly the case when it's a dramatic push, because right now
Hmm.
every retailer, not everybody kind of does the math that I do. I like to look at the numbers, but in each of those examples, I was able to calculate that the Costco kind of pricing on the news not only got all of the tariff, but it gave them a little bit something more. Now, I think probably because they wanted to end with the pricing they had 99, but what I've seen when you have a massive change in pricing, it kind of becomes cover. And so not only is 100% of that going to occur, but more than that. And look at
Right.
what's happening to steel prices right now. The tariff of 50%, you're already having domestic steel folks raise their price, not necessarily the same way. So all of a sudden, it's more than a zero sum game. You have that inflation from the tariff, which I think in the end will be totally passed on to us. You're having a little something extra thrown in, and
Right. You're right. It does provide cover, right? It's a convenient excuse for people to say, hey, and so, I mean, I think if we net this part out, tariffs are going to be inflationary in your opinion, right?
yes,
And it remains to be seen what actually gets signed into agreements and formal, treaties, if you will, between
yes,
companies. But
exactly.
it's certainly there's nowhere to hide from the cost, I don't think there. So if you were an executive or a supply chain leader, uh, you know, given what's going on right now and what you know about shipping, do you have any advice or any plays you'd be making to countermand what's coming?
Well, I think that it first I feel for the many professionals out in the supply chain world that having to wade through this because the complexities and the confusion and kind of the this is going to happen, no it's not, that by itself messes up the supply chains I'm most familiar with. I mean, container shipping, think of it as a rhythmic system. Everything is kind of pulsed on a weekly basis, and when it's working the way it should, you can literally set your clock by the time that ship's going to arrive and when that load is going to get off, and that not only is predictable, but that's where it's at its most efficient. Now we're going into this start, stop, change schedule. That by itself leads to congestion, and congestion, just becomes a extinguisher of capacity. I mean, the supply chain issues that we went through during COVID. Yeah, there was a little bit of a spike in volume. Actually, on an annual basis, you really couldn't see it. It was less volume growth than we had many years. The problem was that came in fits and starts. And the real problem was, for instance, I mean, the epicenter of the supply chain mess worldwide was 110 ships waiting at anchor off the coast of Southern California. And
Right.
all of a sudden that 5 week round trip voyage from China to California or Asia to the West Coast, you know, if you had a ship sitting for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that became a 7 week or 8 week voyage. And so you go through the numbers, you see what happens with capacity. And of course, that capacity then leads to a spiking. And, you had some situations where the spot pricing, went up by a factor of 5 or 6. And so I guess my advice to anybody in that field is kind of, stay focused on your business. Try and have things lined up as much as you can. Try and avoid, trying to make adjustments, because sometimes the adjustment that you make will, turn out not to be a good one. But just
Right.
kind of focus on getting goods in as efficiently and consistently as you can.
Right. Right. Yeah. There was a lot of companies we know, exercise what I'd call a hedge, right? Where they brought in and imported more materials up front. I think that's why we're not seeing the effects maybe of the tariffs. It takes a while for that to make its way through the system, right?
Exactly.
But
And and
now,
and
no,
and in a way,
you
their
can't
own
bank supply
actions
forever.
at making sure, well, let me order more than I need just in case one doesn't make it. That kind of contributes to the congestion issue, if you will.
For sure. Yeah. Not to mention creates working capital issues and everything else for the business, right? So, okay. Yeah, no, it's very difficult time right now to sort of see things. The markets certainly don't like uncertainty. I think they've decided to just continue on and see where things shake out because the day-to-day market fluctuations we were seeing early on when this was happening seemed to have calmed down a bit, but
Yes.
eventually I think there is a risk of stagflation, as you mentioned, and it's certainly an inflationary impact for people. So, John, I want to shift gears with you here to talk maybe about advice, right? For young people, if you could go back and talk to a young John McCown, not that you're that old, John. I don't want to, be offensive here, but I think you've been around the track a while. But if you could go back in time in the Wayback Machine and talk to yourself, give yourself some advice, what would that be?
I think in many respects, I kind of followed what my advice would have been in terms of starting very general, and that's still my advice to my own kids. And when I see young kids that often don't know what they want to do, is when you're looking at your career, think of it as going from the broad to the narrow. Kind of think of particularly like I knew I didn't want to be a banker for my life, but I was pretty sure that experience would be additive. And so,
Mm-hmm.
do something in a very broad area. It doesn't have to be a broad industry, something that will be useful no matter what you do. And that by
Yeah.
definition often is general. I've benefited by multiple mentors in my life. I had a wonderful mentor in banking for a short few years. My greatest mentor was Malcolm McLean, and I still kind of benefit from his insight. Even something as many times as I worked with Malcolm in terms of doing numbers, it would surprise many people to find. But Malcolm was a big believer with a yellow pad and a pencil and doing numbers himself. Going through multiplications, and I came to appreciate that this was a way of his literally getting inside the numbers. He had a granular understanding. He used to, the fundamental of analysis, breaking it down into as simple pieces. And so Malcolm used to always like to look at something from a shipper perspective. If Bristol Myers is moving something from Chicago to Puerto Rico, how many miles, and kind of look at the numbers. So I encourage people to do that because when you do that, you develop more of an insight. I'm a big numbers person, and so I can't get too far away from a situation without looking at the numbers. And I think not as many people do that as much as they should. They kind of come up with a view of what they want to do, then they find numbers to support it, and oftentimes it takes a longer time to do it. But when you go into something, as much as possible, try and get the numbers. And then I think also always just the other thing that Malcolm was perhaps the most observant person I ever had dealings with. His eyes were always open. He embodied the concept when he'd be at a marine terminal, of kind of management by walking around, just kind of taking things in. And everybody should do that. When I give presentations to some of the merchant marine academies, Kings Point or SUNY Maritime, when I'm talking to these young students, I say, look, when you're on a vessel, pay attention, learn with the cargo that you're carrying. Where's it going to? You have a lot of time on your hands. You can kind of think about this. Remember that It was Malcolm McLean, as a truck driver, when he started, that, in the mid 30s, he was delivering a load of cotton to Hoboken, New Jersey. And that was back in the days of break bulk cargo. And, because he wouldn't pay the $10 fine to the Irish foreman, he didn't, was way back in the line. But Malcolm had, as he said, I had 6 hours of watching them manhandle loads out of the truck and put it in a cargo net. And, I started to think there's got to be a better way. That was kind of the genesis of container shipping. So always have your eyes open. I benefited immensely, as I said, from mentor relationships and working with interesting people that, in a way, my two of my bosses were billionaires. My current boss at the Center for Maritime is a 4-star admiral. So I've been blessed to kind of work with very accomplished, very, very bright people that, you can't help but learn from. So you always want to gravitate towards that. So that's kind of my 2 cents to young people in general.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think keeping an open mind, right? Being able to take in others' opinions and points of view, and to keep your eyes open and watch things, right? I think it's not just your eyes, but your mind, and be open to different ideas and say, why is that like that? And
Exactly. Yes.
maybe there is a different way to do this than I'm doing it today, right? And I worked for a VP at GE, and he says, ask a million questions, right? Because that's the only way you're going to learn. And I think it does benefit you to know things right down to the wood, right? Right down to the screws in the floor. That's great. Now, in your career, and I might know the answer to this, you've had a great career. Is there anybody that you'd like to, acknowledge here in this, if you will, moment of gratitude that helped you become who you are today?
Well, all of the people that I referenced, sadly, a couple of them aren't still with us, but Malcolm had more of an impact on me than anybody, and I still kind of acknowledge that in many ways. A book that I wrote, I had always tried to encourage Malcolm to write a book, get a professional writer, and he was, in the end, he thought that was just blowing. He didn't like to blow his own horn, and when I almost had him doing that after his friend J.B. Hunt wrote a book, the famous trucking guy, and Malcolm, I thought I had him to agree to do it, but then in the end he said, "Well, John, when I'm gone, maybe you should write a book." So the book that I ended up writing, it kind of started largely as a book about Malcolm, and there's more ink about him, but it's called Giants of the Sea. And it's kind of really a focus on 9 different entrepreneurs. Again, Malcolm kind of at the top of the heap. But and in many respects, one of the things that I do like, Malcolm is still kind of an under-recognized entrepreneur for what I think he did. I've often thought that there was something that a couple of think tanks years ago put together, something called the Human Progress Project, and it was meant to kind of identify mankind's greatest advancements and kind of charting, the pivotal times in history. And related to that, they announced they said, we're going to announce once a week somebody we call a hero of progress. And most of these people were dead long ago. I mean, it was Johannes Gutenberg, the printing press. It was Jonas Salk. It was Louis Pasteur. A lot of people that invented vaccines that, kind of saved people. And their 17th hero of progress was Malcolm McLean. In the write-up, in the profile, they said, this is the guy that invented container shipping. Container shipping is what made world trade possible. World trade has pulled, 300 million people out of poverty. And it was interesting to me that the 50th hero of progress, which was really the only other businessman, was Bill Gates. And Bill Gates was more in the area of his philanthropy. And so a new friend of mine wrote a book recently that's at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, a fellow named Mark Workman. And Mark, a great author, but the book that he wrote is entitled The World's Greatest Capitalist. And it's the story of Thomas J. Watson and, the digital revolution. And I've chided him in a friendly way I'm certainly not disagreeing with that, but I've said, Malcolm McLean, would be somebody, if one were looking, because if you really start to think of what has come out of container shipping, and the invention of container shipping, between prosperity and people out of poverty. And again, I happen to think that I'll stand up in front of any crowd and say globalization is great, and
Yep.
nobody has benefited more from it than the U.S. And
Right.
anybody that says differently, quite frankly, doesn't know what they're talking about. So yeah, I think so I've enjoyed. In some ways, I told somebody recently, well, I'm kind of the James Boswell to Malcolm McLean, and so because I clearly, he's the one that did all of these things, and I talk so much about him that I recently had one appearance where somebody got confused and somehow thought that I invented container shipping. Well, I hadn't been born, when that happened, and I certainly am not taking credit for that, but I do like to kind of take credit to make people aware of this extraordinary man and what
Right.
container shipping has done. And so that's why I must admit I take personal what I view as is today not only is really kind of an all-out attack on the concept of trade itself.
Yeah.
Where people are trying to kind of say, well, no, it's just wasn't a good thing, and it's crazy. It's
Right. I can certainly understand your perspective and appreciate where you're coming from, having had the career you had and continue to have in this industry. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's been an enlightening discussion. It's great to get your point of views, and you definitely are a shipping expert. I think you've probably forgotten more about shipping and container ships than most of us would ever remember. But it's been great having you today. I appreciate you taking some time to talk with us and our audience on the Executive Edge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. You take care, John. Till next time.